YouTube can be a truly fantastic way of finding things pertinent to my research and for my documentaries. One such upload is of an edition of the BBC show Late Night Lineup, this instalment being dated 25th of November 1967. By the end of this particular year, production on Late Night Horror was well underway. With this November episode, worker in the BBC Special Effects Department, Jack Kine, is being interviewed, and within are interesting things to do with this show of terrors. Seen in the section uploaded to YouTube is an animatronic fly prop that was built for use in the title sequence. Also displayed is a rubber mask that was used for the same reason, along with a hand prop that played a part in the gory finale to the Corpse Can't Play. At the 6-minute mark are clips from Doctor Who The Abominable Snowmen, episode 4, which is how we have this footage, Cybermats, the target practice Cyberman from the Tomb of the Cybermen, along with a Yeti control sphere being controlled remotely, and a Cyberman gun are also seen. During the summer of 1967, the title sequence for Late Night Horror was shot. It was designed by Charles McGee and shot on 35mm colour film with cameraman Brett Walker. McGee by this point had already designed several opening sequences for programmes, and he thought that they were selected for the show thanks to his opening titles for 1965's The Wednesday Thriller. Their work was displayed at the 2004 exhibition Time Frames, where he was interviewed. Charles recalled that he was inspired by the 1950s sci-fi horror flick The Fly, and said that the overall title sequence was a difficult one to make, but that they were happy with the final results. The music used for the introductory sequence got the track name Moments of Terror whenever it was used and featured on the 1976 BBC album Out of This World, which contained various works from their radiophonic workshop. Dick Mills gets credits for the making of the track in question here. Prior to the recovery of The Corpse Can't Play, the title sequence turned up in a separate find. In 1993, when they were researching the upcoming documentary 30 Years in the TARDIS, a trio of VHS tapes were made available to filmmaker Kevin John Davis. The title sequence so happened to be within one of the tapes, which must have given him quite the fright, I imagine. The material was sourced from the master copy of a showreel held by the Radiophonics Workshop. What happened to it or the original copy of the finished sequence is unknown. Broadcasted a couple hours before No Such Thing as a Vampire, an 80-second teaser for the show hosted by Valentine Dahl was screened. This has also survived. Let's say that I made this video 10-12 years ago. No episode of the show was watchable, and I was somehow able to present a documentary-like video on it. If I had done a public poll on what episode people would have liked to have been found in conjunction, it would not surprise me if The Corpse Can't Play would have been the winner. It personally wouldn't have been what I would have chosen, but now, having watched it twice, I can see why. Bringing in a couple other pieces into the background, we have the 6th Pan Book of Horror Stories. My edition here is from the 1970s, but back when it was first published in 1965, this is where the basis story for The Corpse Can't Play originally came from, being Party Games by John Burke. I also have here a Blu-ray of the 1965 film The Sorcerers, whom cult horror fans may recognise as being a Tygon Films production, same people who would make Witchfinder General with Vincent Price. According to the booklet, the film started out as a treatment entitled Terror for Kicks, commissioned by director Michael Reeves from John. The same page of the supplement then goes on to say, once the screenplay had been written, Burke went off to work on the now wiped, believed lost forever, late night horror as series producer and contributed one of the stories The Corpse Can't Play. This particular Blu-ray I have was issued in 2014 by OEG Classic Movies, and more recently it appeared again in a Michael Reeves box set, but I do not know if this mentioning of late night horror was at all amended to mention the recovery of Burke's episode upon this new issuing and re-release. The book on the show here ends with a biography on the author who sadly passed away in 2011, and the whole volume concludes with the following. In 1968, John saw the publications of 3 more of his movie tie-ins, including Smashing Time and the novelisation of Ian Fleming's Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, but 1968 saw a landmark in television horror with the series Late Night Horror. John's episode, The Corpse Can't Play, based on his short story for the Pan Horror Books Party Games, was aired on the 3rd of May 1968. John watched The Corpse Can't Play on its original airing. He thought it was excellently done and was of the mind that if it hadn't been a lost work, it would have become one of the most influential horror episodes in British television history had it made its way onto repeats, VHS, DVD throughout the years. Although John isn't here to see this release, I'm almost certain that it's never too late, and this marvellous and chilling episode will go on to influence those who watch it for decades to come. Johnny Mains, December 2021. As alluded to, I agree with Johnny here. In fact, I would go a step further and upgrade the word marvellous to masterpiece. I first got the set back in the middle of 2023 and watched the episode once when I got it. Because I had looked into the episode for a section on the show within my 2022 documentary Forgotten Relics, I already knew the shit that goes down in this episode prior to myself watching it for the first time. This created a real edge of my seat experience as I watched in anticipation. I didn't rate it as high as I do now with a second viewing in November 2023. I did think it was excellent beforehand, however, but on my second watch I picked up on so many little subtleties and details peppered throughout the almost 26-minute runtime that I really appreciated, and they added so much to the experience and overall production. The episode opens with a game of musical chairs at the birthday party of our main character, Ronnie. All is going well, but then things take a turn whenever a fellow school student by the name of Simon Potter arrives uninvited. It's not really said as to why Simon turns up, but it could be interpreted that he wanted to feel some love and care for once in his life, as it is very firmly established that Ronnie and his other friends do not like him. Plus, he is a lone child for the most part. His mother works long hours and his father passed away. He in turn has to stay longer at school because there is nobody at home for him. Throughout the episode, before the ending, we get to see many horrible things that the other children do to Simon that makes fun of him and bullies him to a very high degree. At about the middle of the piece, a party game is made by Ronnie, which involves the guests miming what their fathers do for a job, that in turn leads to him mocking Potter's father being dead. This metaphorically spat-on character, as played excellently by Michael Newport, is given a lot of great depth and nuance within. It is really hard to not feel sorry for them, even in consideration of the fact that he ends up being the perpetrator of the completely unhinged and deranged acts at the climax. Right when he steps through the door, you can see that he isn't happy, and Ronnie's mother is really sympathetic to him at the start. The subtleties and details, as I mentioned, are very well implemented and woven within the runtime. Right after Ronnie makes fun of Simon's dad being dead, there's a shot of the former running into his father's arms, with the other watching glumly. This scene is also a really good way of transcribing to the viewers the fact that Potter's dad is gone, plus at how unrelenting the other children are at making fun of him. Another point I would like to add to this is that there seems to be a message about prejudices in the episode. I get this because of how differently dressed Simon Potter is in contrast to other children, with them being more casually dressed in contrast to him, who appears to have attended the party wearing, presumably, his school uniform. There is one or two other children characters that appear to be wearing a school uniform, but Simon is definitely the one with the smartest looking dress sense. Not to mention that I'm pretty sure he's the only character that wears glasses throughout the whole piece. The overall production values are absolutely excellent, particularly during the ending, which add to the disturbing nature of an already very disturbing event. The prop work is brilliantly done, and whereas dated by today's standards, it holds up extremely well. I can't imagine how terrifying this episode would have been to viewers back in the late 1960s. Simply put, this episode is incredible, and I would highly recommend tracking down a copy of the DVD and book if you are a fan of the horror genre. For me, this is nothing short of a masterpiece of psychological horror. I'm going to be rating Late Night Horror, The Corpse Can't Play, a 10 out of 10. If this is anything to go by, God knows how good the other episodes were. It really is, for me, a teleplay that stews on you and somehow gets even more horrible when you think about the implications of what happens and just simply how fucked up it is. The episode had an interesting critical reception for the time. As detailed already, the original story's author was among the 0.8 million that viewed the episode on the original broadcast and in turn praised it very highly. The series received the second highest score for the reaction index utilised, and one reviewer said it was the most horrifying of the 6 episodes. When the instalment was repeated on Friday the 13th, interestingly enough, of March 1970, there was a reaction. Producer Harry Moore wrote a letter in response to one that was of a complaining nature that featured in the Radio Times edition dated 21st to the 27th of March 1970. The criticism was posing the question that if it was at all suitable or morally correct to expose young children to acts as vile as what was present. Harry essentially said that the children utilised were professional actors and were acting out a fictitious situation, and even noted that whilst doing rehearsals, the youths were actually keen to create more ideas that were apparently more horrific than what was asked for in the script, as well as ideas for other stories that seemed to have been too twisted for more to consider. It seems to me then that this was intended as a showing of just how far the imagination of a young mind can go, and that it was all done professionally and correctly by the BBC. The show overall seems to now have been mythologized as basically, quote-unquote, the BBC series so scary it was cancelled, which is incorrect. This is something that has spread to articles that discuss the series and is now somewhat of a cliche when it comes to these spreads on the programme. It is likely that this was a conceived notion that was given life based upon this controversy from the repeat showing of The Corpse Can't Play in 1970, plus the fact that the show was completely unwatchable for many decades after the repeats further seemed to further add to this air and mystique about the series. Plus, it often didn't exceed the 1 million viewer mark, so it's practically impossible that it was seen by enough people for such a stigma to be created about it. Whereas this was from the repeat showing, it is an example of the critical reception of the show overall that was ultimately uneven. For the following bit, note that this is now all based on the first and original transmissions. No Such Thing as a Vampire garnered the programme's highest viewer figures at 1.8 million, but the reaction index showed a lukewarm response. The book paints the critical reception for this episode as being negative, with one saying that the series had started on a note not so much of horror as of nastiness. Another said that it had good build-up but crumbled upon a revelation at the climax. William and Mary dropped to just 0.8 million viewers, with the lowest response on the reaction index documented, but it seemed to have been well received by viewers, with one punnily saying that it was one of a majority from the series that had, quote-unquote, gone working on in my brain. The viewing figures climbed a bit from the second and third episodes, reaching to about 950,000 for the Triumph of Death. The book depicts that the fourth episode was the most frightening and spooky so far to the reviewers cited, but still had divided critical reception overall. Viewer numbers managed to climb back to the 1 million mark for the penultimate installment, The Bells of Hell, and it appears to have been the most well received of the series. One written spread said that it was the most accomplished in the series' goal of being horrifying, saying that it left, quote-unquote, a subtle trail of shudders behind it. Although not providing the viewing figures, the book states that the finale, The Kiss of Blood, had the highest reaction on the previously mentioned index. Because of the nature of how colour television was not the most widely implemented yet, not everybody saw this episode in colour. However, one person that did manage to see it in this new technological advancement stated in regards to the blood spurt at the end that it was, quote-unquote, an impressive and terrible sight. It was positively received, but the book does document a negative review. For some reason, a line from the reception section to the Triumph of Death has been reused here. "2023 had a couple interesting bits of activity with the show as well. One such thing that was a bit eyebrow-raising was that the BBC created a new archive channel and uploaded the title sequence to it as a YouTube short on Halloween. Maybe they just wanted something spooky to go out on the channel, but what got me was that they uploaded it in black and white. Now, I know The Corpse Can't Play was recovered in monochrome, but the title sequence had already been on YouTube in full colour for many years before the discovery in 2016. Not necessarily an indicator of a missing episode discovery, just something that stuck out as being odd to me. Another thing that appeared in October, this time on the 16th, was an article by a site called Atlas Obscura. Overall, it provides a truncated history on the show, plus a look at the recovery of the episode, which in turn led to the founding of the Kaleidoscope Company in 1987 by Chris Perry, who had just recently lost the known print of episode 3 to the anonymous private collector. Overall, whereas there are a couple bits to it that I will criticise, for example, the book on the show states that the surviving episode's print was identified back in 1984, and the article says 1985 for some reason. Plus, there's also the bit of how it says that No Such Thing as a Vampire and The Kiss of Blood had elements of the ghost story in them, which I would personally disagree with, having studied the book. Then again, I don't live anywhere near the BBC's written archives and rely on other things for my documentary-like projects as such. This was overall a great read on the show, and I do recommend giving it a look yourself. Along with some truly incredible, specially commissioned artwork, by Anna Sorokina that I absolutely love. There's an interesting angle of how the writer got to directly interview Chris Perry about the show and the episode Rediscovery by the looks of it. It was a fine 50 years in the making, but the same calm that sustained Perry in the decades before acquiring the episode tempered his emotions after. His memories about that day are surprisingly reserved. Surprised it was so cheap, he sums up. We actually got it for £85, he adds, explaining that other bidders were likely oblivious that it was a missing episode. Bear in mind that most missing TV goes for about £2,500. That was a pretty good bet. Though he had finally hooked his white whale, his reaction was less raving Ahab and more dutiful Englishman. Perry, who only seeks tapes after getting credible leads, isn't even really looking for the other 5 episodes, though he says it wouldn't surprise him if the others were out there. He keeps calm and carries on. On the 5th of December, I uploaded part 1 of my in-depth look at the series. By coincidence, one day later, the channel A Style Dorothy Productions, sorry if I said your name wrong, premiered an obscure BBC horror so scary they destroyed it, which is an 11-minute video focusing on The Corpse Can't Play with a small look at the rest of the series. Thank you to them as well for not only making a great piece of content on this series, but for enabling me to get some good screenshots of the piece from your video. If you've liked my 2 videos on this show and not seen this, then I would highly recommend it. Late night horror overall, I would say, is probably my most wanted to be returned lost television show. I could add more to this documentary here, but for now I'm going to put a full stop. If more episodes turn up, however, I would definitely like to review a physical media release of This Would Be Find.